The most sublime and transcendent episode in the entire history of the World Trade Center would come in the first dark and difficult years after its opening, while the city lay deep in the worst financial crisis of its history, and while the towers themselves, still unfinished on the uppermost floors, seemed to stand as a painfully extravagant monument to folly and misguided ambition. For 6 years following his epiphany in the dentist's office in Paris, Philippe Petit had nurtured his dream, painstakingly perfecting his skills as a high-wire artist and devouring everything he could find about the Twin Towers. In early January 1974, he flew to New York City for the first time in his life to put in motion the next elaborate phase of the illegal escapade he now called simply the coup. He was 24 years old.
When I came to New York, it was winter, and I had a little journal or a little whatever. I wrote my thoughts, and I thought, it's old, it's dirty, it's full of skyscrapers, I love it. That was my first little entry, the first day I saw New York. I remember my first encounter with the Twin Towers. I got out of the subway, it was a long subway ride, and out of the darkness, I emerged at the base of one of the towers and look up, and like a slap in the face, I saw that my dream was impossible. I mean, it was right there in aluminum and glass and steel and concrete behind it. It was right there. It said impossible. And yet, somehow, I actually find myself trespassing over the plaza, still under construction, and sneaking in one of the towers and climbing inside the building until I find myself very close to the top, and until there were no more windows, no more partitions. They were just the skeleton, the beautiful steel columns and beams of the building. And then I emerged, and there were no gates, there were nothing to protect you from the devouring void. And I turned and I looked, and the second I looked at the other tower, another time the word impossible etched itself inside me. But somehow I went back down and looked again from the street, and there I realized it's impossible, but I'll do it. And there was the beginning of a second wave of work, the real work, the work of getting into the building, not into archaeological findings or architectural magazines, but this time it was the monster, the beast, getting into the belly of the beast every day, which I did, hiding myself, disguising myself, sneaking, being caught, abandoning the project, going back to it for 8 months, 8 months in New York. And the towers, the more I got to know them, the more they become an ally. That's why when I say I conquered them, probably it's wrong. I married them, certainly. But they became my friends.
It was 1974. And remember now, I had opened the tower at the end of 70, and I wanted public relations. I needed publicity. I had at least 10 million, 12 million square feet of space. And one day, a young journalist, he said he was, named Philippe Petit from France, showed up in my office with 2 photographer friends of his. These were his buddies. And he said, you know, I'd like to do an article on the World Trade Center. And I said, welcome, that's great. And naturally, I never asked, show me your credentials. And later on, I recognized that the subject always got back to how do those towers move in the wind?
After 8 months of false starts, last-minute reversals, heartbreaking postponements, and maddening delays, the hour of the coup finally arrived. At 6 o'clock on the evening of Tuesday, August 6th, 1974, while one team made its way up into the North Tower, Petit, delirious with exhaustion and seething with the holy madness of his dream, slipped up to the top of the South Tower with 2 Confederates posing as delivery men in tow, carrying with them 3 heavy crates filled with equipment, including a disassembled balancing pole, wire for rigging, 250 feet of 1-inch braided steel cable, and a bow and arrow.
The first problem was how to pass the cable across, how to pass the first line, which will ultimately become a rope strong enough to pull the heavy steel cable. So how to get that fishing line across. It's like 200 feet from center of roof to center of roof, roughly. We had all kind of ideas, and the idea that prevailed was the one I thought was ridiculous. It was a bow and arrow, but it actually worked. So with a fishing line and a bow and arrow, we passed the first line across, and then all night we pulled, and then the cable was secured.
It took all night to complete the complex job of rigging, to anchor and secure as best he could the slender 1-inch cable a quarter of a mile in the sky, across the 130-foot gap separating the two immense towers. 1,360 feet below, Wall Street was just beginning to come to life, when, at a little past 7, on the morning of August 7, 1974, Philippe Petit stepped out onto the slender thrumming wire that stretched across the immense shimmering void.
Whenever other worlds invite us, whenever we are balancing on the boundaries of our limited human condition, that's where life starts. That's where you start feeling yourself living. So when I found myself 1 foot on the wire, 1 foot on the building, and ready to decide to shift my way to become a bird, it was not something new. And after a few steps, I knew I was in my element. I didn't even take the full length of the crossing to get to know the rigging and the vibration of the building and the wire. And then very slowly as I walked, I was overwhelmed by a sense of easiness, a sense of simplicity. And actually I can be seen on the first pictures smiling probably out of disbelief. It's so easy after all those years and months of ups and downs and detours, victories and disasters. Finally, I was carrying my life on a path that was the simplest, the most beautiful, and the easiest.
Down on the street below, thousands of people on their way into work looked up in wonder and disbelief, transfixed by the sight of the tiny figure walking on air between the two towers.
Somehow I found myself spending 45 minutes and doing 8 crossings. There were thousands of people, at some point 100,000 people. And actually, at some point, during these different crossings, I actually could hear my audience a quarter of a mile below. And I could hear them punctuating what I was doing on the wire. Let's say if I would take a bow on one leg or salute the horizon or kneel in front of the tower to say hello to the tower, I would hear almost with an echo, the people cheering, screaming, applauding.
I had in my car a radio that connected me to the police desk at the World Trade Center. And on the day in question, the light went on. And the patrolman at the police desk said, "Mr. T, there's a problem in the World Trade Center." I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "There's a guy walking on a tightrope between the two towers. What should we do?" And I couldn't think of anything else. I said, "Don't let him fall off." And I hung up. So then I drove a little further and I called back. I said, "By the way, this is incredible. There's somebody walking. If he doesn't fall off and he comes on, don't arrest him."
Within minutes, police officers were dispatched to the roof of the South Tower. Sergeant Charles Daniels of the Port Authority Police never forgot the things he saw that day.
Well, after arriving on the rooftop, Officer Myers and I observed the tightrope dancer, because you couldn't call him a walker, approximately halfway between the two towers. And upon seeing us, he started to smile and laugh, and he started going into a dancing routine on the high wire. He then went down to one knee, and we stepped to the background. I said for everyone to be quiet. And at this time, he laid down on the high wire and, you know, just lackadaisically rolled around on the wire. Like, he got up, he started walking and laughing and dancing, and he turned around and ran back out into the middle. He was bouncing up and down. His feet were actually leaving the wire, and then he would resettle back on the wire again. unbelievably, really, to the point that everybody was spellbound in the watching of it. And I personally figured I was watching something that somebody else would never see again in the world. Thought it was once in a lifetime.
During the walks, I had a sense of dancing on top of the world. I had a sense of having a communion with the city of New York, represented by the crowd below. I had a sense of having stepped in otherworldly matters. And at some point in one of the crossings, I lay down on a wire and looked at the sky, and I saw a bird above me. And again, because of my sense were decuplated, I could see that bird pretty high up, and I saw the eyes were red. And I thought of the myth of Prometheus there. But the bird was circling and looking at me as if I was invading his territory, as if I was trespassing, which I was. So at some point I thought the gods, the god of the wind, the gods of the towers, the god of the wire, all those invisible forces that we persist in thinking they don't exist, but actually that rule our lives, might become impatient, might become annoyed by my persistent vagabondage there. So my intuition told me it was time for me to close the curtain of this very intimate performance. It was a walk between me and the towers, and I landed on the same tower from which I started, the South Tower, and then I had the octopus of the authority, you know, grabbed me by their hundreds of arms.
When he came in off the wire, Petit was immediately taken into custody and rudely manhandled down into an underground police station deep beneath the South Tower, where he was formally charged with no fewer than 14 misdemeanors, including criminal trespass, disregarding police orders, reckless endangerment, and performing without a permit. Then he was besieged by an army of admiring reporters.
Why did you do this?
That's the thousand why this morning. There is no why. Just because when I see a beautiful place to put my why, I cannot resist.
Weren't you afraid up there at all?
I was not afraid, but I was just looking what I have in front of me. I have really something which was huge and incredible, you know. So afraid not, but living more than 1,000%. So perhaps that's close to afraid, I don't know. But at the same time, I was happy.
You need dreams to live. It's as essential as a road to walk on and as bread to eat. I would have felt myself dying if this dream would have been taken away from me by reason. The dream was as big as the towers. There was no way it could be taken away from me by authority, by reason, by destiny. It was really anchored to me in such a way that life was not conceivable without doing this.
The astonishing feat of high wire poetry was the highest point in Philippe Petit's life, and in many ways in the life of the Twin Towers themselves. As Guy Tazzoli had predicted, the exploit was front-page news around the country and around the world, and Petit himself became an instant folk hero, and nowhere more so than in New York. In the end, thanks in large part to Tazzoli himself, who personally interceded with the judge, all charges were dropped, and the 24-year-old Frenchman was sentenced instead to perform for a group of children in Central Park.
Philippe Petit was the first person to humanize these things. You know, he put a human mark on them. He said, I don't care about your architect and your plans for world trade. I'm going to walk this thing. And there he did, doing this amazing feat in which the whole city applauded. Because, first of all, it took guts and skill. But also it took these two buildings and he conquered them in some astonishing way that had the whole town cheering. But it was an astonishing moment. And after that, it never happened again. It's as if you did that once. It was not to be repeated.
fabulous, you know. It's just that this guy had done this, and it made the towers belong, if you would, more to New York.
Petit himself would never lose his deep love for the towers. In honor of his achievement, the Port Authority presented him with a free lifetime pass to the observation deck on the South Tower, where, on a bright windswept afternoon not long after his historic walk, he signed his name in indelible ink on a steel beam overlooking the vast canyon where he had danced among the clouds. In the years to come, he would return to the high perch whenever he could, trying, without success, to relive the amazing walk in his mind, and hoping to catch a glimpse one more time of the valiant seagull he had once seen sailing high above him, a quarter of a mile in the sky. It never came. Though few people realized it at the time, Petit's extraordinary exploit marked a crucial turning point in the life of the Twin Towers, and in the life of the beleaguered city that was their home. In the decades to come, the fortunes of both would undergo a remarkable transformation, as the foundering city, all but written off in the darkest hours of the fiscal crisis, began to rise in new and unexpected ways. And as the World Trade Center itself, a hollow mockery when it opened in 1971, finally began to fulfill the grandiose promise of its name.
Well, in many ways, the World Trade Center didn't look to most Americans like something that had anything to do with world trade. It was a little bit like the World Series, not really having much to do with the rest of the world. It might have been more convincing if it had been called something like the Manhattan Business Center. For the rest of the world, though, it came to be the quintessential expression of globalization, in the sense that New York was the capital of the world economy. And in that sense, the two tallest towers in New York were really bound to symbolize economic globalization, even if people living in Manhattan just thought they were the biggest shadow-casting pieces of real estate downtown.
The first changes came while the city still toiled in the depths of the fiscal crisis. In 1975, the observation deck atop the South Tower was opened to the public for the first time, and almost overnight became one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. 1 year later, on July 4th, 1976, the nation's bicentennial celebration came to a stunning climax in New York Harbor, where thousands of small boats and dozens of tall ships could be seen parading majestically against the breathtaking backdrop of the soaring Twin Towers. That same year, a spectacular rooftop restaurant opened for business on the 106th and 107th floors of the North Tower. Suddenly I knew, the food critic Gail Green wrote, that New York would survive. If money and power and ego could create this extraordinary pleasure and instant landmark, money and power and ego could rescue the city from its ashes.
The observation deck and windows on the world were the two things, in my judgment, that turned the city of New York from looking at the Trade Center as some monster downtown to something that was theirs. They began to adopt it, and it was great. It was so successful that you had to wait 7 months to get a Saturday night reservation there unless you knew someone. It was incredible. And we were consistently the highest grossing restaurant in the whole world.
These kinds of things give a building a human dimension. One would hope that the building would have a human dimension in its design. That has always been debatable. It's the case of the Trade Center. But events did happen